Assignment to the 88th Auxiliary wasn't a strategic deployment. It was a deliberate death sentence. Comprised entirely of towering apex predators hailing from high-gravity death worlds, these non-human shock troops served as the military's blunt instrument. With a 90% casualty rate for any outsiders attached to them, humans simply didn't survive the 88th. They inevitably broke under the physical strain, froze during the brutal hazing, or perished in the killing fields. William Recker, however, was far from standard infantry. By the time the dust settled on Kepler, the deadliest aliens in the galaxy hadn't just tolerated the frail human. They had chosen to follow him. General William Spencer didn't even look up from his digital datapad when the transfer orders were finalized. The fluorescent lights of the command bunker buzzed overhead, casting long, sterile shadows across the metal desk. "You understand what this assignment means, Recker?" Spencer's voice was dry, devoid of any emotion. It was the tone of a man balancing a ledger, erasing a problematic integer. William Recker stood at parade rest, his scarred knuckles resting lightly against the small of his back. "It means I am being reassigned to the 88th Auxiliary, sir. Forward deployment. It means—" Spencer finally looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "That you are out of my hair. You refused a direct order to abandon the civilian convoy on Altair. You cost the Coalition 3 dropships and 14 men to save a handful of dirt farmers. You're a liability, Recker, a bleeding heart in a uniform. The 88th operates on logic, brutality, and survival of the fittest. Let's see how your empathy serves you among monsters." Recker didn't flinch. He just offered a crisp salute. "Understood, General." 2 hours later, Recker was standing on the rain-slicked tarmac of Outpost Charlie, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The sky above Kepler 186F was a bruised purple, weeping a constant freezing drizzle. Ahead of him sat the barracks of the 88th Auxiliary. It wasn't a standard prefab human structure. It was a reinforced plasteel dome, scarred by plasma burns and smelling faintly of ammonia and raw ozone. Recker pushed the heavy blast doors open. The noise inside ceased instantly. 3 massive figures occupied the dimly lit room. The Coalition, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, found the native names of these allied species impossible to pronounce over standard comms. Thus, they were issued human designations. It was a humiliating practice, but the 88th didn't care about human names. They only cared about killing the enemy. Nearest the door was a creature the Coalition had dubbed Garrison. He was a silicon-based behemoth, standing 8 feet tall with skin that resembled jagged obsidian. He was currently sharpening a vibroblade the size of a human snowboard. Lounging in a reinforced hammock was Fletcher, lean, avian, and wrapped in thermal cloaks. Fletcher's species possessed hollow bones, but reflexes that made a mongoose look paralyzed. His 4 compound eyes blinked independently, locking onto Recker with cold calculation. Finally, stepping out from the armory alcove was the squad leader, Bradley. Bradley was a saurian, 7 feet of coiled muscle covered in dull gray scales, with a jaw capable of snapping a Durasteel beam. He wore heavily modified power armor, and his reptilian eyes narrowed into golden slits as he looked down at the human. "You are in the wrong sector, meat," Bradley rumbled, his voice a deep, guttural vibration that resonated in Recker's chest. His English was heavily accented, filtered through a translation collar that struggled to capture his species' complex vocal cords. "Orders say otherwise," Recker said, tossing his datapad onto the metal table. "Corporal William Recker, I'm your new logistics and tactical support." Garrison let out a sound like 2 boulders grinding together. It was laughter. Fletcher didn't laugh. He just tilted his head, a series of rapid clicks emanating from his beak. Support! Bradley spat the word like poison. The last human they sent for support lasted 4 days. His heart gave out on a forced march through the sulfur flats. Before him, one caught a stray plasma bolt because he was too slow to find cover. Humans are fragile. You require too much water, too much sleep, and you bleed if the wind blows too hard. I'll manage, Wrecker said quietly, moving toward an empty bunk in the corner. It was covered in dust. Nobody had slept there in a long time. Listen to me, Wrecker. Bradley closed the distance in 2 massive strides, looming over the human. The smell of copper and stale blood wafted off the Saurian's armor. Tomorrow, we drop into the Cobalt Ravines. It is a hot zone. Syndicate forces have fortified the ridge. We are not going to slow down for you. We are not going to cover you. If you fall behind, you die. If you get shot, we leave you. We are not a rescue team for broken humans. Wrecker met the golden eyes without blinking. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't make a bravado-filled speech. He just nodded calmly. Understood, Bradley. I'll see you at 0400. As Wrecker turned his back to unpack his gear, he could feel the weight of their stares. They had already written his obituary, but Wrecker had a secret. He wasn't just a disobedient soldier. Before he was busted down by Spencer, he had been a deep recon survival specialist. He didn't rely on brute strength. He relied on endurance. And humans, if nothing else, were built to endure. The drop was chaotic. The orbital transport didn't land. It simply skimmed the jagged peaks of the Cobalt Ravines and kicked them out the back at 1,000 feet. Wrecker hit the windstream, his grav chute deploying with a violent jerk that rattled his teeth. Below him, the ravines were a nightmare of jagged blue rock, deep shadows, and treacherous footing. The rain here wasn't water. It was a highly acidic condensation that ate at standard armor plating. He watched the 3 aliens plummet ahead of him. Garrison didn't even use a chute. The obsidian giant simply engaged micro-thrusters at the last second, slamming into the rocky ground with a concussive boom that cracked the stone beneath him. Bradley landed with terrifying grace, his powerful legs absorbing the shock, while Fletcher glided down silently, his cloak blending instantly with the shadows. Wrecker touched down a moment later, immediately rolling to disperse the kinetic energy, bringing his customized submachine gun up in a fluid motion. "Move out!" Bradley ordered over the comms, already setting a blistering pace. They didn't walk, they bounded. The alien squad moved through the treacherous, uneven terrain like water flowing down a mountain. They leaped over 20-foot chasms, scaled sheer rock faces using their natural claws, and never once checked their six to see if the human was following. Wrecker didn't have claws. He didn't have an 8-foot stride. He had 2 legs, a grappling line, and a lung capacity pushed to the absolute limit. For the first 2 hours, the pain was blinding. His thighs burned with lactic acid, and his chest felt like it was wrapped in iron bands. The air was thin, tasting of sulfur and ozone. But Wrecker employed an ancient human biological advantage: sweat and pacing. While the aliens expended massive bursts of energy, requiring them to pause briefly to vent heat or recalibrate their internal temperatures, Wrecker settled into a relentless, grueling marathon runner's rhythm. He didn't try to match their leaps. Where they jumped a chasm, Wrecker used a kinetic zipline, swinging across just seconds behind them. Where they scaled a wall, Wrecker found the switchback path, his boots finding impossible footholds. He never stopped moving. Ahead, Fletcher perched on a crag, his sniper rifle resting over his knee. He clicked his beak over the local comms. The human is still behind us, heart rate elevated but steady. He has not called for a halt, Bradley grunted. Give it another hour. The incline steepens. He will break. But the hour passed. Then 2. The acidic rain intensified, hissing against their armor. Wrecker's visor was streaked with grime, his breath ragged, but his eyes remained locked on the massive silhouette of Garrison ahead of him. He was using the giant's wake to block the worst of the wind. It was a tactical conservation of energy. By the 5th hour, a subtle shift occurred. The aliens, built for explosive combat and apex predator bursts of speed, began to show the faintest signs of fatigue. Bradley's strides became slightly heavier. Garrison's internal cooling vents hissed more frequently. They paused beneath a massive rock overhang to check the holomap. Bradley looked back, expecting to see empty space. Instead, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. Wrecker jogged up, his chest heaving, steam rising from his thermal suit. He didn't collapse. He didn't lean against the wall. He simply checked his weapon's battery, swapped a fresh filter into his rebreather, and looked at Bradley. "Next waypoint?" Wrecker asked, his voice tight but steady. Garrison stared at him, his crystalline eyes shifting colors. "You do not possess thermal regulation organs. How are you not overheating?" "Sweat," Wrecker replied simply, tapping the side of his helmet. "Evolution's built-in radiator keeps the engine running." Fletcher tilted his head, the clicking of his beak slower, more inquisitive this time. "Fascinating. A sustained, low-output traversal method, grossly inefficient for hunting, but persistent." "We are not hunting yet," Bradley interrupted, though the edge in his voice had dulled slightly. He pointed a scaled finger at the map. "The data core is in a downed Syndicate courier ship, 2 clicks north, in the valley. We move in, secure the drive, and evac. No heroics." "Understood," Wrecker said. As they moved out again, the pace was just a fraction slower. Wrecker noticed, but said nothing. He knew what they were doing. They were pacing themselves. The human, somehow, was dictating the rhythm of the march. But the quiet of the ravines was a lie. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, the air suddenly erupted. Not with thunder, with plasma. It was an ambush. The Syndicate hadn't just left the downed courier ship. They had used it as bait. The moment Garrison stepped out from the cover of the ridge, the valley floor lit up. A heavy plasma cannon, concealed beneath a camouflage net of local flora, unleashed a torrent of superheated blue fire. The first shot missed Garrison by inches, vaporizing a boulder behind him. The second shot didn't miss. It caught the silicon behemoth in the right shoulder. Even Garrison's dense armor and hardened biology couldn't fully withstand a direct anti-armor blast. The kinetic force threw the 2-ton alien backward, shattering his collarbone and sending a spray of glowing blue-tinted fluid across the rocks. Garrison roared, a sound of pure agony that shook the dirt beneath Wrecker's boots. "Contact! Multiple contacts!" Fletcher screeched, diving backward as a hail of kinetic rounds chewed up the ledge where he had just been standing. "Fall back! Defensive perimeter!" Bradley bellowed, grabbing Garrison by his good arm and dragging him behind a jagged outcropping. Wrecker hit the dirt, crawling to the edge of the ridge. He peered through his scope. The situation was catastrophic. Below them, pouring out from hidden trench lines, were at least 50 Syndicate shock troops. Worse, they had 2 heavy gun emplacements pinning the 88th down, and a mortar team setting up in the rear. "Fletcher, take out those mortars," Bradley yelled, firing his heavy particle rifle blindly over the rock. "Negative!" Fletcher shouted back, pinned down by a suppressive barrage of plasma. "If I peek, I lose my head. They have overlapping fields of fire. Garrison was slouched against the rock, his breathing labored, his blue lifeblood pooling beneath him. My arm, it is non-responsive. They were trapped. 3 apex predators, pinned down by superior numbers and heavy ordnance. The 88th's standard tactic, overwhelming frontal assault, was useless here. They were going to be ground into dust. Bradley looked at Wrecker. The Saurian's eyes held a grim resignation. Human, Wrecker. The evac zone is 3 clicks west. Leave your heavy gear. Run. They are focused on us. You might slip through. It was the ultimate dismissal, but framed, oddly, as a mercy. Bradley expected the human to flee. It was the logical choice. Wrecker didn't move toward the retreat path. Instead, he unclipped 2 smoke grenades and a thermal detonator from his belt. "Negative, Bradley," Wrecker said, his voice terrifyingly calm amid the deafening roar of weapons fire. "Fletcher, you need a 3-second window to take out that mortar team?" 2 seconds is sufficient, the avian replied, but I do not have even half a second. "You're about to," Wrecker said. Before Bradley could grab him, Wrecker sprinted out from cover. He didn't run away. He ran parallel to the ridgeline, directly into the enemy's line of sight. "Fool!" Bradley roared. But Wrecker wasn't being foolish. He was exploiting human physiology. He was small, fast, and completely erratic. He didn't run in a straight line. He serpentined, throwing himself into slides, bouncing off rocks, using the chaotic geometry of the terrain. The Syndicate gunners, used to tracking massive, predictable targets like Garrison or Bradley, suddenly had to adjust their turrets to track this tiny, incredibly agile speck. The heavy plasma cannon swung toward Wrecker. For 2 seconds, the fire lifted off the squad's position. "Fletcher, now!" Wrecker screamed over the comms, diving behind a stalagmite as a plasma bolt melted the rock where his head had been a millisecond prior. Fletcher popped up. His rifle cracked twice. Down in the valley, the Syndicate mortar team slumped over, their explosive payloads detonating in the tubes, wiping out a dozen enemy troops in a massive fireball. "Mortars neutralized!" Fletcher called out. But Wrecker was now pinned down, 50 yards from the rest of the squad, with the heavy gunners zeroing in on his rock. He had maybe 10 seconds before the stalagmite was vaporized. He didn't panic. He pulled the pin on the thermal detonator, wrapped the 2 smoke grenades around it using a strip of hypertape, and calculated the arc. He couldn't throw it far enough to hit the gunners, but he didn't need to. He threw the bundle straight up, targeting the unstable, overhanging ice rock formations on the cliff face directly above the Syndicate trenches. The detonator went off in midair, a blinding flash of heat. The smoke grenades ignited simultaneously. But the real devastation was the shockwave. The blast shattered the structural integrity of the ice rock above. With a sound like a thunderclap, a massive avalanche of jagged boulders and razor-sharp ice cascaded down into the valley, directly onto the heavy gun emplacements. The shrieks of the Syndicate troops were drowned out by the crushing weight of the mountain falling on them. Dust and thick smoke plumed into the air, completely blinding the surviving enemy forces. Wrecker scrambled back through the dust cloud, sliding into the trench next to Bradley and the wounded Garrison. He was covered in rock dust, his suit scorched, but his eyes were bright and focused. He immediately dropped to his knees next to the giant silicon alien. He ripped off his medical kit. "Human medicine will not work on me," Garrison rumbled weakly. "I'm not using human medicine," Wrecker grunted. He pulled out a heavy-duty plasma torch and a canister of fast-curing industrial epoxy, stuff used to repair dropship hulls. "Hold him still, Bradley. This is going to suck." Wrecker ignited the torch. He didn't apply a bandage. He quite literally spot-welded the bleeding silicone vessels of Garrison's shoulder, cauterizing the wound with extreme heat, then flooded the cratered armor with the industrial epoxy to seal the breach. Garrison thrashed, his eyes flashing violent crimson in pain, but Bradley held him down with all his might. "Done," Wrecker gasped, cutting the torch. "It's a dirty patch, but it'll keep your internal pressure stable until we hit the med bay." Garrison blinked, the crimson fading back to a dull, stable blue. He flexed his massive hand. The arm was useless, but the fatal leak had stopped. The giant looked at the tiny human, then at the smoking crater in his shoulder, and back to the human. The valley below was quiet, save for the moans of the trapped syndicate troops. The ambush was broken. Bradley looked down into the valley, then turned his golden eyes to Wrecker. The Saurian commander didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at the scorched armor of the human, the ingenious, brutal medical patch on his heavy gunner, and the smoking ruins of an enemy force that should have killed them all. Bradley stood up, slowly, ignoring the enemy stragglers retreating in the distance. He walked over to Wrecker, and in a gesture Wrecker had never seen a Saurian perform, Bradley placed his massive scaled fist over his own chest and gave a slight, respectful bow. "I was wrong," Bradley's voice rumbled, devoid of its previous contempt. "You are not a broken thing, William Wrecker. You are a weapon." Wrecker wiped the sweat and grime from his visor. He finally allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I'm just support, Bradley, ready to move when you are." The smoke from the avalanche still hung thick in the air, tasting of pulverized limestone and burnt ozone, as the 88th Auxiliary descended into the valley. They moved with a new, unspoken formation. Garrison, his right arm fused and useless against his side, took the rear. Fletcher, his sniper rifle sweeping the dust clouds, took point. Bradley and Wrecker moved together in the center. The Saurian commander didn't hover over the human anymore. He treated Wrecker's blind spots as actual tactical liabilities to be covered, not inevitabilities to be ignored. The downed Syndicate courier ship rested at the bottom of a shallow crater, its sleek, manta-ray hull scorched by atmospheric entry and orbital anti-air fire. It was a dark, brooding piece of machinery, completely silent. "Therm optics are scrambled," Fletcher reported, his four eyes whirring as he adjusted the lenses on his visor. "The hull is coated in a radar-absorbent polymer. I cannot see inside, but the blast doors are sealed." "Stand back," Bradley grumbled, stepping up to the main airlock. He unslung his heavy particle rifle, adjusting the dial to maximum yield. The Saurian braced his massive legs and fired. The beam of pure, accelerated energy struck the airlock door with the force of a localized sun. For 3 seconds, the plasteel glowed cherry red, then white hot, before completely vaporizing in a shower of sparks and molten slag. "Subtlety was never our strong suit," Garrison grunted from the rear, a hint of dry humor filtering through his translation collar. They entered the ship. The interior was plunged into emergency crimson lighting. Gravity was offline, and the ambient temperature was dropping rapidly. Wrecker switched his helmet to low-light amplification, sweeping his submachine gun through the narrow, angular corridors. They found the courier crew in the bridge. They were already dead, not from the crash, from cyanide-equivalent capsules. The Syndicate didn't believe in leaving loose ends or captured operatives. "Cowards!" Bradley spat, looking at the gray-skinned aliens slumped over their consoles. He turned to the central terminal, a massive column of flashing biometric locks and encrypted hard drives. "Fletcher, extract the data core." The avian stepped forward, interfacing his wrist comp with the terminal. His talons flew across the holographic keyboard with blinding speed. For a minute, Only the rapid clicking of his beak broke the silence. Then he stopped, his feathers ruffling in agitation. "It is a dead-hand lock," Fletcher announced, his voice laced with frustration. "Quantum encrypted. If I attempt to brute force the decryption, the core will flood with localized acid and melt the drives. It requires a specific biometric key from a syndicate command tier officer, which we do not possess." Bradley slammed a scaled fist against the bulkhead, leaving a deep dent in the metal. "We march through hell for a locked box? We cannot extract the terminal. It is wired into the ship's fusion plant." "Let me look at it," Wrecker said quietly, stepping past the towering saurian. "Human, this is not a mechanical door. This is a quantum firewall," Fletcher clicked, stepping aside nonetheless. "Your species is known for physical endurance, not superior cybernetics." "I'm not a hacker," Wrecker admitted, looking under the console. "But I used to work in orbital salvage back on Earth. Old tech. Stuff built by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin before the Coalition even existed. When systems got too smart, we had to find dumb ways to break them." Wrecker dropped to his knees and pulled out a multi-tool. He didn't look at the holographic display or the flashing quantum locks. Instead, he unbolted the physical paneling beneath the terminal. "What are you doing?" Bradley asked, leaning over. "The firewall is quantum, yes. It's software," Wrecker grunted, pulling away a sheet of metal to reveal a nest of fiber optic cabling and power relays. "But the acid flood mechanism? That's hardware. It relies on a physical solenoid valve opening to dump the corrosive payload onto the drives." Wrecker clamped his flashlight between his teeth. He rummaged through his pack and pulled out a small, heavy-duty cryogenic canister, standard issue for cooling overheated plasma rifle barrels. "If the software detects a breach, it sends an electrical signal to the valve," Wrecker explained, his hands moving delicately among the wires. "But if the valve is frozen solid at absolute zero, it can't open. The signal bounces back." He located the chemical reservoir, a reinforced tube sitting directly above the data core. Wrecker pressed the cryogenic canister against the valve mechanism and hit the release. A hiss of supercooled nitrogen flooded the compartment. Frost instantly crystallized over the metal, turning it a brittle, stark white. "Fletcher," Wrecker said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Brute force it." Fletcher hesitated, looking at Bradley. The saurian nodded. The avian's talons danced across the keyboard. Alarms immediately screamed through the bridge. Flashing red text flooded the holograms. "Unauthorized access. Purge initiated. Purge initiated." Under the console, a dull clunk sounded as the software tried to trigger the acid valve, but the frozen metal held. It didn't budge a millimeter. "Error. Valve malfunction. Override. Override." "I am in," Fletcher breathed, his compound eyes wide. The firewall dropped to initiate the physical purge and trapped itself in a logic loop when the valve failed. "The core is unlocked." A mechanical whir sounded, and a glowing cylindrical drive slid smoothly out from the console. Bradley reached down, hauling Wrecker to his feet by the shoulder harness. It wasn't a rough gesture. It was an anchor. "A dumb way to break them," the Saurian repeated, a low rumble of amusement in his chest. "I will remember that." "Grab the drive," Wrecker said, his eyes suddenly narrowing as he looked at the primary console. "Wait, Fletcher, pull up the courier's final transmission log. Who were they bringing this data to?" Fletcher tapped a command. "The manifest indicates a rendezvous in the Perseus sector. The recipient is listed under a Coalition encrypted frequency." Fletcher ran the frequency through the squad's onboard decipher key. When the name popped up on the screen, the temperature on the bridge seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Recipient, Major General Richard Hayes, Coalition Central Command. Hayes, Recker whispered, the blood draining from his face. He's the head of Sector Defense. He dictates our troop movements. He is a traitor, Bradley snarled, his hand tightening on his rifle. He is selling coalition deployment schedules to the syndicate. That is why they were waiting for us in the ravines. He sent us here to be buried. The mission hadn't just been a suicide run. It was a cleanup operation. We need to get this corps to the High Tribunal, Recker said, his voice hard. Which means we need to get off this rock. They didn't get far before the sky betrayed them. Kepler 186F was notorious for its unstable atmosphere, and the thermal explosion Recker had triggered during the ambush had violently altered the local pressure systems. As they climbed out of the valley, the bruised purple sky turned a sickly, sulfurous yellow. Ion storm, Fletcher warned, his feathers flattening against his body. A bad one coming in from the east. It will strip our comms and blind our thermals. And it provides cover for them, Garrison rumbled, pointing his good arm back toward the valley. Through the rising haze, sleek, fast-moving shapes were descending from the ridges. They weren't standard syndicate shock troops. They wore matte black, adaptive camouflage armor and moved with terrifying, fluid synchronicity. Syndicate hunter-killers, Bradley hissed. Elite trackers. They have realized the data core is gone. Evac Site Zulu is still 12 clicks out, Recker checked his wrist comp, watching the topographical map glitch as the ion interference worsened. Through the sulfur flats. We cannot outrun them in the open, Garrison said, his voice strained. The industrial epoxy patch on his shoulder was holding, but the giant was moving sluggishly, his internal systems fighting a massive shock. We don't outrun them, Recker said, a cold, calculating light in his eyes. He unslung his heavy pack, dumping out his rations, spare clothing, and anything that didn't explode. We make them bleed for every inch. Bradley, take point. Keep Garrison moving. Fletcher, you're the eyes in the back of our heads. I'm going to leave them some presents. For the next 2 hours, the retreat through the sulfur flats became a masterclass in human guerrilla warfare. The flats were a desolate expanse of cracked yellow earth, interspersed with bubbling geysers of toxic gas. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters as the ion storm hit, howling with deafening force and raining down stinging, static-charged dust. Recker fell back, working in the blinding storm. He didn't have heavy ordnance, so he used ingenuity. A human didn't fight an apex predator head-on. A human dug pits. A human used traps. He rigged his remaining kinetic zip lines across 2 towering stalagmites at neck height, practically invisible in the swirling dust. He wired his last 3 Claymore-equivalent directional mines to tripwires buried under a thin layer of loose sulfur crust. He even took a spare, high-yield battery pack from his radio, cracked the casing to expose the volatile core, and left it sitting innocuously next to a bubbling geyser, wired to a pressure plate. He caught up with the squad just as the first distant explosion echoed through the howling wind. A heartbeat later, a muffled scream reached them. "Trip the wire," Recker reported over the localized short-range comms, his breathing heavy. 10 minutes later, a bright blue flash illuminated the storm behind them, followed by the concussive thump of the rigged battery pack detonating. "You fight like a cornered rat, human," Fletcher clicked over the comms, but there was no insult in the avian's tone. It was pure, predatory admiration. "Back on Earth," Recker panted, matching Bradley's punishing stride. "We call it asymmetric warfare. You use the environment when you don't have the guns." But the hunter-killers were relentless. The traps slowed them, thinned their numbers, but they adapted. The pursuers spread out, moving in a crescent formation to flank the retreating squad. Disaster struck at the 9-kilometer mark. A hunter-killer sniper, utilizing a magnetic rail rifle that punched straight through the ion interference, took a blind shot through the dust. The hypervelocity slug missed Bradley's head by a fraction of an inch, but clipped Fletcher's right wing. The avian let out a piercing shriek, tumbling sideways into the acidic dirt. The slug hadn't just broken the hollow bone, the kinetic shockwave had shattered it. Wrecker and Bradley were on him instantly, dragging him behind a cluster of sulfur mounds. Fletcher was shivering violently, his compound eyes wide with systemic shock. "I cannot fly," Fletcher gasped, clutching the ruined appendage. "I cannot even walk. My balance equilibrium is tied to my wingspan. I am dead weight." The avian looked at Bradley. "Leave me. I have enough battery in my rifle to hold them for 3 minutes." It was the doctrine of the 88th. The weak were left behind. Survival of the unit superseded the survival of the individual. Bradley looked at Fletcher, then out at the swirling storm where the hunter-killers were closing in. The Saurian commander's jaw tightened. He raised his hand, preparing to give the order to abandon their scout. "Like hell, we're leaving you," Wrecker snarled, cutting off Bradley's command. Before the Saurian could argue, Wrecker grabbed Fletcher by his heavy tactical harness. The human, already exhausted, muscles burning with lactic acid, hoisted the alien avian onto his back. Fletcher was lean, but he still weighed 160 pounds, plus gear. "Human, put me down! You will die!" Fletcher protested, clicking frantically. "Shut up," Wrecker grunted, adjusting the straps so Fletcher's good arm was over his shoulder. He looked up at Bradley, his eyes burning with a fierce, irrational defiance. "Nobody gets left behind. That's my doctrine. Now move." Bradley stared at Wrecker. A human, the most fragile creature in the galaxy, carrying a wounded predator through an acid storm, while refusing an order from a superior officer. A deep, rumbling growl echoed in Bradley's chest. It wasn't anger. It was respect. "Garrison, take the human's right flank," Bradley roared over the howling wind, hoisting his heavy rifle. "We break through for the 88th." Site Zulu was a raised plateau of black volcanic glass, offering a clear landing pad for the evac dropship. But as they dragged themselves up the final incline, the sky above was empty. "Command, this is Auxiliary 88, Wrecker screamed into his comms, the static almost deafening. "We are at Site Zulu. Where is our ride?" Through a momentary break in the ion interference, a robotic, automated voice crackled back. "Auxiliary 88, evac delayed due to atmospheric instability. ETA, 15 minutes, hold your position." 15 minutes, Garrison wheezed, dropping heavily onto the glass plateau. His blue blood was starting to leak through the epoxy patch. "We do not have 15 minutes. Below them, the storm broke slightly, revealing the grim reality. A dozen matte black hunter-killers emerged from the sulfur haze, their weapons raised. They stopped at the base of the plateau, forming a firing line. They knew they had their prey cornered. Wrecker gently lowered Fletcher to the ground behind a low ridge of volcanic glass. He handed the avian a spare battery pack for his rifle. "Can you shoot with one hand?" Wrecker asked. Fletcher rested the barrel of his sniper rifle on a rock, his beak clicking in a rapid, deadly rhythm. "I do not miss, William Wrecker." Wrecker smiled grimly. It was the first time any of them had used his human name. Bradley stepped up beside Wrecker, his heavy power armor scarred and smoking. He checked his particle rifle. The power gauge blinked red. 10 shots left, then we use our hands. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Wrecker said. He drew his submachine gun. He had 2 magazines left. The hunter-killers didn't yell. They didn't charge blindly. They advanced with chilling, silent precision, laying down a suppressing field of plasma fire that turned the top of the plateau into a blistering inferno. "Here they come!" Bradley roared. The Saurian opened fire, his heavy particle beams vaporizing 2 of the advancing assassins instantly. Fletcher's sniper rifle cracked a second later, taking the head off a third. But there were too many. A plasma bolt caught Bradley in the chest plate, the kinetic force knocking the massive Saurian to his knees. Another grazed Wrecker's thigh, searing through his Kevlar weave suit and burning the flesh beneath. The human let out a sharp hiss of pain, but didn't stop firing. They were 50 yards away, then 30. Wrecker's gun clicked empty. He slammed in his last magazine. "They are flanking left," Garrison shouted, unable to raise his weapon, trying to use his massive body as a shield for Fletcher. 2 hunter-killers vaulted onto the plateau, their energy blades igniting with a lethal hum. They rushed Bradley, aiming to end the commander while he was down. Wrecker didn't think. He acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. He threw himself forward, sprinting directly at the 2 assassins. He slide-tackled the first one, kicking the alien's knee joint with all his strength. The alien stumbled, its energy blade swinging wild. Before the second assassin could react, Wrecker pulled a combat knife from his boot, 7 inches of high-carbon earth steel, and drove it upward, right through the unarmored gap under the alien's jaw. The assassin collapsed. Wrecker rolled, barely dodging a downward strike from the first one. Before the blade could fall again, a massive scaled hand clamped around the assassin's throat. Bradley, fighting through the plasma burn on his chest, hoisted the hunter-killer into the air and crushed its windpipe with a sickening crunch. The Saurian dropped the body and hauled Wrecker to his feet, pulling him back behind cover just as a hail of kinetic rounds shattered the rock where they had been fighting. "You are insane, human," Bradley panted, blood dripping from his jaws. "Just keeping you alive, Commander," Wrecker gasped, clutching his bleeding thigh. 10 yards away, the remaining hunter-killers prepared for the final rush. Wrecker dropped his empty submachine gun. He pulled his combat knife from the dead alien's neck and gripped it tight. This was it, the end of the line. Suddenly, a shadow blotted out the sulphurous sky. The air pressure dropped violently. The roar of heavy VTOL thrusters drowned out the storm. A coalition, heavy dropship, scarred and battered, but heavily armed, descended through the clouds, hovering directly over the plateau. The side doors slammed open, revealing twin rotary autocannons. The sky tore open. A torrential rain of depleted uranium rounds shredded the plateau's base, turning the remaining hunter-killers into a fine red mist in less than 2 seconds. The dropship touched down, its ramp lowering heavily. "Auxiliary 88! Get on board!" A voice boomed over the ship's loudspeaker. Bradley hoisted Fletcher onto his shoulder. Wrecker got under Garrison's good arm, straining under the giant's weight, and together, the shattered, bleeding squad limped up the ramp. As the doors sealed shut and the dropship blasted into orbit, leaving the hellscape of Kepler 186F behind, the cargo hold fell dead silent. Wrecker collapsed against the bulkhead, sliding down until he was sitting on the grated floor. His lungs burned, his leg was bleeding heavily, and he had never been so exhausted in his life. Across the bay, Bradley was tending to Fletcher's ruined wing, while Garrison slumped in a jump seat, finally allowing his eyes to dim in rest. Bradley stopped his work and looked across the bay. He stood up, walking slowly over to the exhausted human. The giant saurian looked down at Wrecker. Then He reached out a massive scaled hand. Wrecker looked at the hand, then up at Bradley's golden eyes. He reached out and grasped the Saurian's forearm in a warrior's grip. Bradley hauled Wrecker to his feet, ignoring the disparity in their size. "We are returning to base," Bradley's deep voice resonated in the quiet hold. "We have a data core to deliver. We have a traitor to hunt. And William Wrecker," Bradley's grip tightened slightly, a gesture of absolute, unyielding loyalty. "You are 88th now, until the end." Aegis Prime, the central hub of Coalition Command, was a floating fortress of durasteel and transparent aluminum suspended in the orbit of a pale gas giant. It was a place of pristine corridors, immaculate uniforms, and bureaucratic warfare. It was not a place meant for the bleeding, battered remnants of the 88th Auxiliary. When the heavy dropship touched down in Hangar Bay 4, the medical teams that rushed the ramp stopped dead in their tracks. They expected a squad of unstoppable alien shock troops. Instead, they saw a limping Saurian carrying a shattered avian, a towering silicon giant leaking blue fluid, and a human covered in scorched armor and alien blood, holding the line. "Get a triage team down here now," Wrecker bellowed, his voice raw, waving his empty submachine gun to clear a path. "We need high-density skeletal fusion for the avian and an industrial chemical synthesizer for the silicon. Move!" They were rushed to the critical care wing. Wrecker refused a bed. He let a terrified medic staple the plasma burn on his thigh, closed, and inject him with a massive dose of synthetic adrenaline. But he didn't take off his armor. He sat on a metal crate outside Fletcher's surgical suite, the stolen syndicate data core resting heavily on his lap. Bradley emerged from the trauma bay 2 hours later. The Saurian's chest plate had been replaced with temporary medical mesh, and his golden eyes looked tired. He sat heavily next to the human. "Fletcher?" Wrecker asked, not looking up. The human doctors used a titanium alloy weave, derived from old Boeing aerospace designs, to rebuild his wing. Bradley grumbled softly. "He will fly again. Garrison is in a chemical stasis pod regenerating his armor. They will live." "Good," Wrecker said, his jaw tightening, "because we have a war to finish." He tapped the data core. "Hayes doesn't know we survived. He thinks the ion storm and the hunter-killers buried us on Kepler. If we go through standard protocol, if we hand this over to a mid-level intelligence officer, Hayes's Palantir-based surveillance algorithms will flag it in seconds. The data will be wiped, and we will quietly disappear out an airlock." Bradley looked at the human. "Then what is your tactical proposal?" "We don't go through the chain of command," Wrecker said, standing up, his stapled leg protesting violently. "We take this directly to the High Tribunal. General Spencer is presiding over the quarterly strategic review today in the Apex Spire. All sector commanders are present, including Hayes." Bradley's lips pulled back, exposing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "We walk into a room full of generals, covered in blood, and accuse the head of sector defense of treason." "Exactly." Wrecker chambered around in his sidearm. "It's a high-visibility execution. If we do it in front of the entire tribunal, Hayes can't cover it up." The Apex Spire was heavily guarded, but the 88th possessed a unique advantage. They were monsters, and they terrified the standard military police. When Bradley and Wrecker strode through the gleaming white corridors, the pristine parade ground guards took one look at the towering, battle-scarred Saurian and the grim, heavily armed human walking in his shadow, and wisely decided to look the other way. They reached the heavy mahogany doors of the tribunal chamber. 2 elite sentinel guards crossed their halberd rifles, blocking the path. "Halt! The tribunal is in a closed session," the guard on the left stated. Bradley didn't speak. He simply reached out, grabbed the thick metal shafts of both rifles, and bent them downward until the barrels snapped with a sharp crack. He pushed the doors open. The vast circular chamber fell instantly silent. 12 coalition generals sat around a massive holographic war table. At the head of the table sat General William Spencer, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he recognized the human he had sent to die. To Spencer's right sat Major General Richard Hayes. Hayes was a polished, silver-haired man with an immaculate uniform. But for a fraction of a second, as his eyes locked onto Wrecker and the data core, the color drained entirely from his face. "What is the meaning of this?" Spencer barked, recovering his composure. "Wrecker, you are supposed to be deployed on Kepler." "We were, General," Wrecker said, walking straight toward the center of the room, slamming the heavy cylindrical data core onto the glass of the war table. "And we found exactly what we were sent to find, a syndicate courier ship." Murmurs erupted around the room. "Guards!" Hayes stood up immediately, his voice cracking slightly. "Arrest these men! They are violating quarantine protocols and interrupting a classified briefing." "Sit down, Hayes." Bradley's voice boomed like rolling thunder, echoing off the high ceilings. The sheer predatory menace in the Saurian's tone made 3 of the generals physically recoil. "We extracted the ship's black box," Wrecker continued, staring dead at Hayes. "It contains the courier's final transmission logs and the recipient of their encrypted data drop. It was a schedule of the Coalition's outer rim patrol routes. A tragic loss," Hayes interrupted smoothly, his panic fading into calculated political maneuvering. "But bringing a raw data core into the heart of command is a catastrophic security breach. General Spencer, this man is a known insubordinate. He is likely infected with syndicate malware. I order—" "The data drop was scheduled for a rendezvous in the Perseus sector," Wrecker spoke over him, his voice rising, raw and unyielding. "The recipient frequency was yours, Major General Hayes." The room erupted. Spencer slammed his fist on the table. "Silence! Wrecker, that is a charge of high treason against a commanding officer, if you do not have irrefutable proof." "Plug it in," Wrecker challenged, pointing at the war table's main interface port. "Boot up the core. Read the quantum signature yourself. The encryption key matches Hayes' personal biometric cipher." Spencer reached for the core. "I said no!" Hayes shouted. He slammed his hand down on a hidden panic button beneath the rim of the table. Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors blew inward. Not with standard guards, but with a dozen heavily armed private military contractors. They wore unmarked tactical gear, wielding high-end General Dynamics plasma carbines. They were Hayes' shadow detail. "Kill the aliens!" Hayes screamed, pointing at Wrecker and Bradley. "And the human, they are syndicate spies." The tribunal chamber devolved into absolute chaos. "Down!" Wrecker tackled General Spencer, throwing the older man behind the reinforced plasteel base of the war table, just as a barrage of plasma fire melted the chairs they had been sitting in. Bradley didn't take cover. The Saurian roared, a primal sound of pure fury, and charged the doorway. He caught the first 2 mercenaries mid-stride, using his massive bulk as a battering ram, crushing them against the marble archway. Plasma bolts scored deep burns across his shoulders, but the Saurian's adrenaline was absolute. "Wrecker, we cannot hold this room," Bradley shouted, snapping a contractor's wrist and claiming his plasma carbine in one fluid motion. Wrecker grabbed the data core off the table. He looked at Spencer, who was staring at Hayes in horror. Hayes was retreating behind a wall of his mercenaries, escaping through a side executive elevator. "General, lock down the spire!" Wrecker yelled over the deafening gunfire. "Don't let him off this station!" Wrecker laid down a sweeping burst of suppressive fire with his sidearm, taking a mercenary in the knee, and sprinted toward Bradley at the main doors. "Through the hall! Move!" They burst out of the tribunal chamber and into the sterile corridors of Aegis Prime. Sirens wailed, bathing the hallways in flashing red emergency lights. The station's automated defense grids were confused. Hayes had triggered a localized lockdown, tagging Wrecker and Bradley as the hostile intruders in the system. "Where are we going?" Bradley demanded as they sprinted down a maintenance stairwell, the sound of heavy boots echoing above them. "He controls the central network. He will lock out the data core before we can broadcast the evidence." "Not if we take it offline," Wrecker panted, his wounded leg screaming in agony with every step. "We need a terminal that isn't connected to the Aegis Prime mainframe. An isolated system with enough juice to crack the secondary encryptions and broadcast a wide-beam transmission to the entire fleet." "There is no such system on this station," Bradley grunted, kicking open a blast door leading to the lower engineering levels. "Yes, there is," Wrecker grinned fiercely, a wild light in his eyes. "Earth logic, Commander. Never throw away a perfectly good warship. Sector 4 dry dock. They decommissioned the USS Leviathan 3 years ago. It's an old Northrop Grumman dreadnought. It's offline, sitting in mothballs, but its analog communication arrays run on independent nuclear batteries. They descended into the bowels of the station, moving through the labyrinthine cooling systems and hydraulic lines. Twice they encountered patrols of Hayes's contractors. The first squad, Bradley ambushed from the ceiling shadows, dropping among them like a nightmare of teeth and claws. The second squad had them pinned at the end of a long, open catwalk over a fusion reactor core. Wrecker used his multi-tool to overload a localized steam valve, creating a massive, blinding cloud of superheated vapor. He then slid across the grated floor, firing blind into the smoke based purely on the muzzle flashes of the enemy. It was reckless, dirty fighting, and it left 3 contractors dead and the rest retreating in panic. "You fight without honor," Bradley observed, stepping over a body, smoke rolling off his scales. "Honor is for the dead," Wrecker replied, swapping his empty magazine. "I fight to win." They reached the heavy airlock of Sector 4 dry dock. Through the reinforced glass, they could see the massive, angular silhouette of the Leviathan. It was a relic of the early human expansion. Blocky, heavily armored, and completely dark. Wrecker bypassed the airlock keypad by shorting out the magnetic lock with his combat knife. They stepped onto the gantry leading to the dreadnought's primary airlock. Suddenly, Wrecker's earpiece crackled. Static hissed, followed by a series of rapid rhythmic clicks. "Fletcher," Wrecker tapped his earpiece. "You should be in the ICU. I discharged myself," the avian's voice came through, sounding strained but sharp. The human doctors were displeased. "I am in the station's primary ventilation hub above the dry dock. I have tapped into the internal cameras. Hayes has dispatched his elite tactical team. 20 men, heavy armor. They are entering the dry dock from the lower tram lines." "He knows what we're trying to do," Wrecker cursed. "Fletcher, do you have a weapon?" "I acquired a standard-issue human marksman rifle from a sleeping guard," Fletcher clicked. "It is primitive. The recoil is atrocious. I will make do." "Garrison?" Bradley asked over the comms. "Still in the stasis pod," Fletcher reported, but his heart rate elevated when the alarm sounded. "He is angry." "Keep him there," Wrecker said, stepping into the dark, dusty corridors of the Leviathan. "Fletcher, give us covering fire. We need 5 minutes to power up the bridge terminal and broadcast this data." "I will give you 6, Fletcher replied. Wrecker and Bradley sprinted through the silent ship. Dust floated in the beam of their weapon lights. The air was stale, smelling of old oil and cold iron. They reached the bridge, a cavernous room filled with dead screens and analog switches. Wrecker dropped to his knees in front of the central communication console. He ripped the paneling off, exposing the thick power cables. He unspooled a portable jump wire from his kit and jammed it directly into the Dreadnought's dormant emergency battery reserves. With a low, groaning hum, the bridge flickered to life. Amber screens booted up with ancient command prompts. Wrecker plugged the Syndicate data core into an auxiliary port. His fingers flew across the dusty keyboard, interfacing the advanced quantum drive with the Dreadnought's brutalist analog architecture. "Come on, you old beast," Wrecker muttered. "Talk to it." Down in the dry dock, the sound of a heavy sniper rifle echoed, a thunderous crack that shook the gantry. "One down," Fletcher reported calmly. "They are deploying heavy shields, advancing on the gantry." "Bradley," Wrecker looked up, the progress bar on his screen crawling agonizingly slow. "They're going to breach the bridge before the upload finishes." Bradley hefted his stolen plasma carbine, standing in the center of the bridge, facing the main doors. The Saurian didn't look worried. He looked exactly like what he was, the deadliest apex predator in the coalition military. "Let them come," Bradley rumbled. "I will show them the doctrine of the 88th. The heavy blast doors of the Leviathan's bridge didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges by a shaped breaching charge. Smoke poured into the room, followed immediately by laser sights cutting through the dust. "Suppressing fire!" a mercenary captain shouted. A hail of plasma and kinetic rounds flooded the bridge. Wrecker ducked behind the heavy steel of the communication console, the metal pinging and groaning under the onslaught. The upload bar read 42%. Bradley didn't hide. As the mercenaries poured through the doorway, the Saurian unleashed a continuous beam of plasma fire, vaporizing the lead man's shield and the man behind it. When his carbine clicked empty, Bradley threw the weapon itself like a missile, the heavy metal stock crushing the helmet of a third mercenary. Then he waded into them. It was a bloodbath. In close quarters, human mercenaries, no matter how elite or well-equipped, were no match for a fully enraged Saurian. Bradley moved with terrifying speed, his claws tearing through ceramic body armor like paper. He grabbed a mercenary by the tactical rig, hoisted him into the air, and threw him entirely across the room into a bank of dead monitors. But there were too many. A mercenary flanked Bradley, aiming a heavy concussive shotgun directly at the Saurian's wounded chest. Before he could pull the trigger, Wrecker popped up from behind the console. He didn't use his gun. He threw his heavy, high-density flashlight perfectly, striking the mercenary squarely in the temple. The man staggered, and Wrecker closed the distance in 2 steps, sweeping the man's legs and driving an elbow into his throat. "Upload at 70%!" Wrecker shouted, diving back to the console as a line of bullet holes stitched across the floor where he had just stood. Suddenly, a voice echoed over the dry dock's PA system. "Wrecker, Bradley, stand down!" It was Major General Hayes. He was standing on the gantry outside the ship, flanked by 4 massive, heavily augmented cyborg bodyguards. He looked furious, his pristine uniform now disheveled. "You are trapped," Hayes' voice boomed. "There is nowhere to go. Hand over the core, and I will ensure you get a quick execution. If you force me to breach that ship myself, I will make it last for days." Wrecker looked at the screen. 88%. "He's panicking," Wrecker grinned, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. "He knows what this ship is doing." "Can you make it go faster?" Bradley grunted, pinning a struggling mercenary to the floor beneath his massive boot. It's transferring terabytes of encrypted data through a 20-year-old copper wire system, Wrecker yelled. It's a miracle it hasn't caught fire. Outside, Hayes lost his patience. Kill them! Burn the ship down! The 4 cyborg bodyguards stepped forward. They leveled heavy rotary plasma cannons at the bridge windows. I do not think so. The voice that echoed through the dry dock didn't belong to Hayes. It was deep, grating, and sounded like tectonic plates grinding together. Through the thick plasteel window of the bridge, Wrecker and Bradley saw a massive shadow drop from the maintenance rails high above the dry dock. It was Garrison. The silicon giant landed on the gantry with a force that buckled the heavy metal plating. His armor was still scarred and incomplete, his right arm still fused with Wrecker's industrial epoxy patch. But in his good left hand, he held a massive, ripped-off support girder from the station's infrastructure. Garrison didn't hesitate. He swung the massive steel beam like a baseball bat, catching 2 of the cyborg bodyguards in the torso. The impact was deafening. The cyborgs were instantly shattered, thrown off the gantry and down into the abyss of the dry dock. Fletcher! Garrison roared. From his sniper nest high in the ventilation shafts, Fletcher fired twice. The massive, high-caliber human rounds tore through the remaining 2 cyborgs' heads, their advanced shielding completely useless against the kinetic force of a top-down strike. Hayes was left standing completely alone on the gantry, staring in absolute terror at the towering, battered alien giant blocking his escape. Inside the bridge, the console chimed. A green box flashed on the screen. Transmission complete. Broadcast secure. Wrecker let out a long, shuddering breath. He slumped against the console. It's done. Within seconds, the alarms on Aegis Prime changed pitch. The red flashing lights turned a solid, authoritative blue. Over the station's main comms, General Spencer's voice echoed, cold and absolute. All coalition forces, this is General Spencer. Major General Richard Hayes is hereby stripped of rank and declared an enemy of the coalition. Apprehend him immediately. Lethal force authorized. Hayes dropped his sidearm. He fell to his knees on the gantry, raising his hands in surrender as Garrison loomed over him. The war was over. 2 days later, Wrecker stood in the pristine hangar bay of Aegis Prime. He was out of his armor, wearing a crisp, newly issued coalition dress uniform. His leg was heavily bandaged, and he leaned slightly on a cane. General Spencer stood before him, holding a data pad. The tribunal has finished reviewing the data, Spencer said, his tone entirely different from the day he had banished Wrecker. It was filled with a grudging, profound respect. Hayes was supplying our patrol routes to the Syndicate for years. He orchestrated the ambush on Kepler to silence the 88th because they were getting too close to a major Syndicate supply line. You exposed him. Spencer cleared his throat. In light of your actions, the Coalition is dropping all previous charges of insubordination. Furthermore, you are being offered a promotion to captain and a transfer to any command unit of your choosing. Deep Recon Special Forces. Name it Wrecker. Wrecker looked out across the hangar bay. Sitting near the open ramp of a heavily repaired assault dropship were 3 figures. Garrison was undergoing final armor plating procedures with a welding drone. Fletcher was testing the articulation of his new titanium wing, his feathers ruffling proudly. And Bradley stood by the ramp, his heavy power armor gleaming with a fresh coat of matte gray paint, his golden eyes watching the human intently. Wrecker turned back to the general. He didn't salute. He just smiled. With all due respect, General, Wrecker said, gripping his cane. I already have a unit. Spencer sighed, though a small smile touched the corner of his mouth. You're a madman, Wrecker. They are a death squad. They aren't meant for humans. They're a little rough around the edges, sir, Wrecker said, turning and walking toward the dropship. But I'm the logistics and tactical support, and right now, my squad needs me to patch a leaky plasma manifold. As Wrecker reached the ramp, Bradley stepped forward. The towering saurian didn't say a word. He simply raised his massive fist and struck his own chest, the ultimate salute of a predator to a warrior. Wrecker hit his chest in return, the sound echoing in the massive hangar. He walked up the ramp, taking his place among the monsters. He had been thrown to the wolves, expected to be devoured. But William Wrecker didn't just survive the wolves. He became the leader of the pack. If you found your heart racing alongside William Wrecker and the legendary 88th Auxiliary, hit that like button to show your support for humanity's unyielding spirit. This story proves that when humanity is pushed to the absolute brink, we don't just break, we adapt, we overcome, and we earn the respect of the stars themselves. What was your favorite moment from Wrecker's brutal survival on Kepler? Drop a comment down below and let us know. Don't forget to share this epic sci-fi drama with your friends who love a true underdog story. And if you want more thrilling, high-stakes HFY battles and incredible intergalactic twists delivered straight to your feed, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have plenty more adventures waiting in the cosmos.